Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual event put on by Book Passage, Elliott Bay, and Rakestraw Books. It is our great pleasure tonight to welcome Katherine May with her latest book, Enchantment, Awakening Wonder in an Anxious Age. As we are connected here, and she's in conversation with the wonderful and inimitable Pico Iyer, great friend of the store. And I think about he's in Japan, she's in England, and as we connect these disparate parts, we have to think about the technology that's allowed that and how much our lives have changed. At the same time, without this sort of closeness, in this time since the pandemic, we've also sort of felt this small effect on our lives, this shrinking effect in a way. And I think that this book is an incredible anecdote, a blend of memoir and insight and real wisdom that kind of alleviates and takes on this way of reconnecting with the world in a full and holistic way. Katherine May is the New York Times bestselling author of Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. Been translated into 25 languages around the world. It's a huge hit. She is also the host of a major podcast, as well as writing for the New York Times, the Times of London, Good Housekeeping, Cosmopolitan, and others. Pico Iyer, his latest book is The Half-Known Life, and of course he is a great friend to this store and a wonderful author who has synthesized so much curiosity and memoir and the experience of travel and encounter with cultures, and I cannot think of a better person to be hosting this conversation tonight with Katherine. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Bernard from Rakestraw Books. Oh.
Hi, I just wanted to welcome all of the Rakestraw customers to this event. So thanks for being here. And thank you, Katherine and Pico, for joining us.
Oh, pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you, Ram, and thank you, Michael. And thank you especially, Katherine. It's so really nice to see you. Congratulations on this. I know it's been out only a few days, and already I was noticing online it's been inspiring and exciting. So many people, just the way Wintering did a couple of years ago. So are you at home in England right now?
I am, yeah. I'm in Whitstable on the southeast coast, so it's really cold here, actually. I've got the wintering vibe, to be honest, right now, rather than the enchantment vibe.
And it's really late, too. I think it's 10 o'clock at night. Is that right, where you are? So,
which is late for me. Like, it's not late for other adults, but for me, that's like, I would normally be sound asleep by now. I'm doing really well.
Good. Well, double thanks for joining us. Just as Avram was saying a minute ago, I got the sense when Enchantment begins that you're in a state of, you're somewhat stuck with free-floating anxiety, maybe fear, having difficulty concentrating. And so I was wondering, how much do you think that was a result of the pandemic and how much not?
I think a little, and I think the pandemic was a big catalyst for me. I mean, on one hand, it took me away from a lot of the parts of life that I didn't particularly like. I'm a complete introvert. I don't particularly enjoy the company of other humans, or I think I don't anyway. And I do enjoy my own company. And so at the beginning, it felt quite luxurious to me in a lot of ways. But quite quickly then, time just began to grind to a standstill. And so did I. I felt like my mind was just on its lowest kind of battery life. I compare myself to an electric toothbrush in the book. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that partly made me realize how much I needed the company of other people. But as I began to reflect about the causes, I don't think it was just that. I feel like over the last decade or more, there's been this ramping up of hostilities from the outside world and this increasing sense of threat and imminent, like genuinely imminent danger. And also just a kind of dumbfoundedness at what's happening in the world and a sense of dislocation from what other people think and what I think. I don't think that it was just the pandemic, but the pandemic certainly helped. But there was more going on and a bigger confusion to tackle, I'd say.
Which in a curious way to me is somewhat hopeful, because if it wasn't created by the pandemic, and if some of it is within ourselves perhaps, then maybe the cure is in ourselves. And that's part of the inspiration I took away from the book.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, like in lots of ways, I found that pandemic time quite inspiring, because despite the fact that we all fell out and disagreed over it, and I think what we've learned is that humans will disagree over anything if you give them a forum to disagree in. It was an incredible time, I think, of feeling the connectivity between us, which is just a major inspiration for this book. This sense of being a very small part of a much bigger organism. And like one of the big insights for me was that, in the UK, our lockdowns were, I think quite extreme compared to America, in that we weren't really allowed to go out at all. I certainly wasn't allowed to swim in my local sea. I wasn't allowed to walk in my local woods. They were all taped off. I wasn't allowed to drive anywhere to go and walk. And there was a broken connectivity there between me and the landscape that I didn't realize was there until it was broken. And I think that was one of the things that really got my cogs turning on this book. Like, not only am I part of a bigger human organism, I'm also part of a material world that is flowing around me in ways that I hadn't really understood before.
Yes, and therefore, when the pandemic began to ease, my sense is you really worked hard to repair that sense of connectivity. And one of the strong notions I got from the book is that wonder doesn't involve passively sitting back and waiting for inspiration to come. It involves actively going out and engaging with the world. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, sitting still is not one of my strong points. It's like, what do I do next? What do I do? But I felt this restlessness, but I also, I didn't know how to fulfill it. It was amazing. I mean, I don't know if other people found this, but I found it amazing how quickly my habits changed and became completely ingrained by those rules that had been set, which I resented and strained against, but obeyed absolutely, and very willingly. But as soon as those rules went, I couldn't get out again. I'd been fixed in this set of behaviors, and I didn't know how to go out and walk. I didn't know how to get up from my desk. Like, I was clinging to this thing like a life raft. And I needed to actually just physically get my body moving again before I could think.
Yes, I mean, I came away with the sense that we weren't just locked inside our homes, but we were locked inside our minds. And you have this wonderful sentence that the body has answers to questions we didn't even know to ask. And I got this strong feeling in your book. You talk about knowing with your hands rather than knowing with your head. Do you talk a little bit about that and what that involves?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about Enchantment is exploring different ways of knowing and different forms of wisdom. And I, like, full disclosure, I'm a lifelong head person. Like, I very happily live in my head. And actually, I find it really difficult to inhabit my body. But as time goes on, I realize how important it is to leave my head, even just occasionally. It feels very safe in there. And so I guess part of the exploration I was doing was like, how can I know in non-verbal ways? How do I know through walking? How do I know through being in a space? How do I know through making something? And I was thinking about that when I was describing the tides and how my understanding of what a tide is shifted as I kind of contemplated it. And for me, it was about shifting from head knowledge that I might be able to copy down in an exam, which I've always loved doing, incidentally. Like, I'm one of these weirdos that just thought exams were the best thing that I could spend my time with. But instead to, like, how do I understand tides more intuitively? And that is I mean, it's odd territory for a book because I'm actually trying to escape words in quite a lot of this and find ways to know outside of the verbal and the linguistic. And that's kind of part of the journey. And of course, that made writing it quite hard.
Yes, because you're really describing what you're feeling in your bones. It's funny, in the depths of the pandemic, I was doing an event with a hospice organization. At the very end, they surprised me by saying, leave us with one sentence of wisdom, which of course I didn't have. And I think they were looking for something analytical or philosophical. I said, take a walk. And when I read your book, I got the sense that maybe Katherine also would have pretty much said that.
Yeah, actually, I was just blind panicked and gone, I don't know, I've got one to say. I hate it when people ask me questions like that. But the other one I hate is when people jump on me like, what's your favourite X? And I'm like, I don't like anything. I don't know anything. But yes, I agree. I think, do something. And that often for me is take a walk. But I mean, one of the things that I turn to, at the peaks and troughs of life, is making food, and it like going through a process with my hands and engaging all my senses in that activity. You know, tasting it, feeling the texture of it, smelling it, is a really great processing tool for me for whatever it is I'm trying to process. And like a recipe does not cover the work that cooking will ever do for me. It's an entirely separate thing.
I really loved, I think there's one sentence in which you said, you can make a cake without a recipe. You know when to pick a blackberry and you can identify a field mushroom. And I think you gave the sense that you absorbed all of that when you were quite young. And one of the things that came across strongly for me in the book was the presence of your grandparents. And I think you grew up in your grandparents' house. Can you tell us a little bit about forms of enchantment you absorbed then, or how you look back on it with gratitude now?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I did. My mother and I moved in with my grandparents after my parents' divorce, and I loved that. I mean, my mum hated it. You can imagine having to move back in with her parents, but I absolutely loved it because it meant that in many ways I grew up in a different era to a lot of people of my generation. Like my childhood is located quite squarely in that post-war period, even though it was in the 80s, because they were still living that life. You know, they were two people who never had a car. They carried on doing all their laundry by hand. They grew all their own vegetables. Everything was cooked from scratch. And I don't think I could live that life. It was a very, very quiet life. But it was a life that had its gentle rituals, and it was always a soothing place to be. Mm-hmm. And as I've grown older, I mean, I'm sure I sentimentalize them, but then actually my whole family does. Like, we all look back on the life that we had with them with a kind of wonder, because they were just very soothing people to be around. They were not, you know, they were not wise in the sense that they were handing stuff down. You know, when you read these books about like wisdom my grandfather told me, like, that they were not people to do that, but they were people who knew life in a very, very intimate way, and in a way that I so often feel very separate from. And so yeah, there's a lot of passages in this book which goes back to my life with them and to the feel of it rather than the sort of language of it. You know, how it felt to be in the living room with my grandmother every afternoon when she would just sit and peel an orange, and everything would feel silent as she did it, because she just loved that afternoon ritual of peeling an orange. Mm-hmm. And now that's so sacred to me, and I can return to it over and over again in my mind, and there's nothing that would deliver to anyone else other than me, just to know how it felt to be in that room and how calm and safe and beautiful that space felt. And I wonder for myself, like, how do I make those spaces in my own life now that feel just as calm and just as complete?
It sounds like that has something to do with attention. I think when you begin the book, you're talking about distraction and being unable to concentrate and just having an orange in front of you. And it sounds like your grandparents' life was fairly uncluttered. And
absolutely
close to the earth. I mean, one of the titles I thought the book could have had was The Goddess of Small Things, in the sense that it's very tiny things open up the universe to you, like peeling the orange. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like it's interesting for you and I to talk about this because you're the great traveler who finds things across the world, whereas I grew up with people who didn't travel, honestly. And I've always stayed close to home. You know, I've never moved very far from where I grew up. I don't have wanderlust particularly, and I get more and more interested in the very local and what our lands mean to us, like what our local landscape means to us, and how I can inhabit it more deeply. And it does seem to offer me endless detail, endless depth, and endless exploration. And it's, you know, you can find the big picture in the small, I think. And I think I can trace that directly back to my childhood, because we lived a very small life, and I spent a lot of time wondering if it was big enough and if it was good enough, and whether the things that I found beautiful were actually beautiful. You know, I always had this doubt about that there were these things that I thought were wonderful, these sites that I would drive past, these little bits of countryside that I would think were pretty. But even then I was thinking that, but no, this isn't like on TV. So therefore this isn't enough, and maybe we're not enough. And it's taken me like the whole of my adulthood to come back and go, no, we were really enough. And that lands for me at a time when I think people feel more pressure to live big lives than ever. Everyone has to be famous now. Everyone has to be remarkable, and we don't respect these very ordinary, quiet lives, which are the stuff that all of the universe is stitched together from.
Yes, and that wonder lies in very unremarkable seeming places and things, because it's to some degree in the eye or in the heart of the beholder. You have this, I remember there were some sound mirrors from the 1920s, and you mentioned in your book, which the kind of thing you would drive past, but you suddenly turn your eyes to them and realize how remarkable they are.
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, I actually went hunting for them quite a while ago. I've been obsessed with the Dungeness Peninsula for a long time, but that was because it's where my family visited when we were children, you know, like, so I carry on, like I don't let places go. But then one day I read that these sound mirrors existed, and I thought, well, how come I never saw them? Like it seems like they're remarkable. Early sonar technology, really significant, like in the development of how we kind of intercept sound now. Well, why isn't there like a theme park around them? You know, why isn't there someone taking tickets? And so I found them on a map and went off to find them, and they have a little interpretation board, but really nothing else. And they're extraordinary. They're these enormous concrete ears. They're known as the ears locally. And to see them, to stand next to them, is to realize that sound waves are real. I don't know. I struggled to really believe that was actually what was happening until you see them, and you can see this physical thing that can intercept a giant wave of sound, and you can stand by the focal point, which used to move but's now rusted, and you can hear what's coming in across the English Channel. And I mean, to me, that's completely magical, because there's all this invisible information in the air around us that we have no way of perceiving. And yet you build this giant block of concrete with a bowl inside it, and suddenly it's there. I mean, I can't think of anything much more wonderful, honestly. I really can't.
Yeah, it's a kind of reminder of everything we sleepwalk past. And, you know, the other title I thought the book could have enjoyed was Meteor Showers, which play quite a part. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about them.
It was nearly called When the Stars Fall, so you're quite close.
I like that.
I think we might have needed you though, because we did agonize over a title. So yeah, like one of the early touchstones of the book was I'd read about this meteor shower in 1833, where the whole east coast of America, if you're awake at the right time of night, saw the most extraordinary meteor shower that's ever been really recorded in history, where something like 10,000 stars a minute were visible. So the whole sky was absolutely full of falling stars. And because of the sort of nature of the storm, they were curved, so you could see them curving around the earth. And the reports at the time just took my breath away, because people described feeling like they could perceive the planet moving under their feet, and a lot of them thought the world was going to end, but a lot didn't as well. And I think that was one of the first artifacts of my research that made me think about this book, about this shift to meaning making that happens when we witness extraordinary things. And so towards the end of the book, I returned to this idea because I don't think I'd ever realized that meteor showers happen regular as clockwork across the year. There is a fixed timetable of them all through the year. And while I've seen shooting stars when I've been out at night before, I've never realized that you can intend to see shooting stars. And you can look at a certain place in the sky to make sure you see them if you've got a clear night and you wait out long enough. And wow, there's no one that you could tell. If you tell anyone you've seen a shooting star, they will say to you, wow, that's amazing. That I'd have loved to have seen that. But how many of us sit out to see them? Because we just could. We could just do it. And yet we'll sit up to watch a reality TV show where celebrities are being humiliated in the jungle or something like that. I mean, it when you focus your attention on this, it makes no sense whatsoever. But I'm as engaged in that behaviour as everyone else. And so at the end of the book, I went out in search of a meteor storm, and I didn't find one. So that will cut down on all my smuggery about why don't we do this? Because it's harder than you think when there's a supermoon.
But, I love at the end of the book when you go out to see the meteor shower and don't find one because you find a moon shadow. In other words, the very process of going out, even if you don't find what you expect to find, other wonders are all around. I think
I've realised it's a big theme in my work, this, not finding the thing I set out to do. I quite often write about that. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, that heroic journey does not always come off. And it's never the point anyway. The end game is never the point. It's the process that's always the point. And I got a lot from that process, without a doubt.
Well, I loved it when you just said a heroic journey, because literally I was about to say the soul's journey, and thinking of the snow leopard, for example. And I think the classical works of spirit are about not finding what you were looking for because you didn't know what to look for until you found something different. And I think you say in the book, as you almost said a minute ago, 12 meteor showers every year, but we never think to see them. Yeah. And when I was reading that, I was also thinking that people do make quite an effort these days to go out and witness an eclipse. And it seems that maybe they're doing that partly to feel that almost ancient sense of fear and excitement and awe that they had in 1853 with the meteor showers. And that takes me back almost to your grandparents. And this sense I get throughout the book that in our rush to enjoy all the wonderful fruits of new technology, we're sweeping aside a kind of old wisdom where there really is, whether it's through your grandparents or just through these ancient impulses, longings. Is that a fair assessment of what you feel?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Just and it's about knowledge, but it's about this kind of knowledge that we don't value, that is so simple about the everyday running of life. And my grandma never cooked from a recipe book, and she cooked exactly the same food every week. We had a routine, on a Sunday you'd have a roast, which meant on a Monday you'd have a stew of that thing, and on a Tuesday you'd have a curry of that thing, but not a curry that anyone outside England would recognise as a curry. And on Wednesday you'd have a salad with that, and it was, and so on and so on, and that never deviated. And we loved that food. Honestly, I wish to God I could go back to that Sunday, every Sunday, around the table with my whole family all gathered together, cracking the same jokes every day. And my cousin and I had the same fight over who got the cherry chocolate in the chocolate box at the end. And she always won because she was bigger than me. And I would kill to go back to it. Honestly, it was so boring. It was so boring and so mundane and so repetitive. And it was my whole universe. And I secretly loved it at the time. And I don't think I could even provide it now. I just don't think it would work because my family has shrunk and there are so many other demands on the outside. And I don't think anyone in my household would, consent to doing the same thing every week. But I would. And I wish I could provide that now. But times have changed. The shops are open on a Sunday now. Everyone's on the internet and everyone's out doing something. And my family have scattered across the world, and it's no longer achievable. But whenever I can, I'm always gathering my people around the table on a Sunday because it was sacred.
Mm. Yeah, I love that sense that having the same food every day, but it never got old, and the world never gets old. Exactly. And when you're talking about your household and the challenge of the present moment, it makes me think that the other protagonist of the book, it seems to me, is your son, Bert. You mentioned glancingly your husband, whom you refer to just by his initial. Your little boy, Bert, is the one who accompanies you on many adventures. And you were just talking about providing wonder for him. And I wonder how you address being a mother in this time when it's so hard to find the deepest forms of wonder.
Yeah, it is hard. But at the same time, I hate the way we talk about children now, that we only ever say that they're forever on their screens. And that's like the only thing we can find to kind of conceptualize what our children are. And my son spends a lot of time on a screen, and I'm constantly policing it, but it's a losing battle. And of course, during the pandemic, he found his entire social life on the screen. He would have, as an only child, he would have been so isolated if all his friends weren't getting together as a class, and then they were playing computer games together in the afternoons. And so it's really complex, actually. And our children are very lonely and they do not get any freedom to go out on their own. And I found that I've reached an age with him where I'd be happy for him to go out roaming a little bit more, but none of the other children are allowed. And so he can't. And it's at the same time, I want to pass something on to him, and some of the knowledge that I had, but also some of the knowledge that I didn't have. I write in the book about how my mum, who's upstairs, so I have to talk really quietly. My mother hates nature. It's her worst nightmare. She doesn't like mud. She doesn't like the cold. She doesn't like rain. All of it is awful. And so we never really walked in nature. And as an adult, I've had to learn to do that, and I've had to learn all the skills around it, and I've had to learn that sense of permission, actually, to feel like I'm entitled to enter those spaces. And I desperately want to pass that on to my son as his birthright, that he is allowed to go here, and here's how you do it, and here's how you behave, and look, this is the name of this thing, and this is the name of that thing, and you can do this, that, all of that stuff that I feel like other people maybe got. And he doesn't want to hear that from me, because he does not want me being didactic to him. That's the last thing that he wants from me. But I have realized when we're out that he finds his own way to pay attention to it. And it's kind of my job to make space for that attention to develop rather than to keep interrupting it. And so there's a passage in the book where where I'm busy going, look at this tree, look, this is called an ash, and here's the hoops that hold the buds, and it's really exciting. And he's like, stop it, I'm growing branches in my head, and every time you talk, you chop them off. And I thought that was such a perfect expression of what it's like to fall into that particular mental state that comes when you're at deep rest in nature. And also a perfect description of exactly what I was doing as a parent, which was saying, like, I don't care about what you're doing. Here's the thing that I'm going to tell you. And it's become a phrase that we pass between us now. He just has a little thing. He did it. Funny enough, I was thinking about it before I came down here, because he was in the shower and I came in like, come on, get out of the shower, like it's time to get into bed. He's like, Mom, I'm growing branches. I was like, okay, I'm backing off.
Well, exactly. And I think because he has those open eyes, open mind, open heart of a child, my guess is our children are often our teachers when it comes to wonder.
Completely. I mean, they do it so easily, don't they? I think. And I think if I'm going to teach him anything, I need to show him that adults can still feel it, and that he'll still have permission to feel that as he enters adulthood, rather than to show him an adulthood that is so dry and so cut off from that. That's what worries me the most about what I might pass on.
This, I apologize almost for this question, given what you said before when someone asked you a question about wisdom, but would you say, brace yourself, would you say this is a religious book?
Almost. It skirts that territory, doesn't it? I mean, what I was struck by reading your book was how similar we are, in that we're both really drawn to religious communities and religious concepts and practices without ever having been able to make that shift into belief. And I think a lot of this book is actually about that. I think that visited me very forcibly during the pandemic, I guess, when I could no longer hold back the feeling that I'd had for a long time, which was that there's something bigger out there that I can sense and perceive, but I can't explain, and I can't make sense of it, or I haven't found an account that makes me go, that's it, that's everything. And it began to feel like much more effort to hold it back than it did to believe. And that was, I mean, that's like the vulnerable core of this book. And it's the bit that I feel the most awkward about when I'm talking now, because it feels really exposing. It's not something I could have talked about 5 years ago. No way. And it's funny, I don't know if you're related to this, and you might be too discreet to say it, but being interviewed by Americans the last couple of weeks about the book, they have this so un-English, kind of ability, which I think is amazing, to kind of open an interview with like, so tell me about God. Whereas, like, in the UK, when people interview, they're not asking about that bit because they carry that English sense of embarrassment about that kind of thing. And I wonder how much of my inability to deal with this stuff is cultural, honestly, because it's absent from the culture I grew up in as well, and that's. But it's something it's something that's there for me in a way that I'll never. I don't think I ever want to fully make sense of. I mean, again, it's like the quest is the thing for me, and I'm beginning to understand that my work with this is to keep reimagining it and reconceptualizing it over and over again, and to keep reaching for fresh language to describe it, rather than ever feeling like I've found that language and it's fixed and I'm going to repeat that for the rest of my life.
Yes, that you don't need to explain it or make sense of it. And actually, that's the beauty of the world. It's far beyond our reckoning. And you just gave exactly the perfect explanation for why I moved from England to the US as soon as I could when I finished college.
I can well imagine, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel much more at home in that culture that's so curious, like genuinely curious and unembarrassed by all of those things. I feel a little like a little out of place sometimes, because I'll be, the book comes out in the UK next week, and I'll be so interested to find out how readers deal with that aspect of the book, because I think it takes us deeply into embarrassed English territory, honestly.
Embarrassed English territory. Though I think really what the grace of the book is that I mean, you don't have to think in religious terms to respond to that notion of longing and vulnerability, as you said, because I do feel that a lot of what you're writing about is the beauty of ritual and the beauty of congregation. And it's an interesting word you choose to use, because many of us would say community, which I think you just used, but congregation has that very different. And I love the way that you describe at length having a group of people that you swim with and going to learn about beekeeping as much as anything to have a congregation. And ritual, you mentioned earlier, which is maybe one of the things that we've lost in our more scattered world now, but that steadies us.
Yeah, I mean, I think congregation and community are slightly different in that I think congregation is an aspect of community when part of a community get together with intention, and it's something that's very hard to find in a secular world. And I think about it a lot because as we secularize in this country, I think one of the tragedies is the way that congregations are breaking down, and that means that there's far fewer places for like the outsiders to find a place that will always welcome them in. I mean, that's one of the amazing things that congregations do, is they're deliberately elastic and they're deliberately heterogeneous, and they have a moral code that demands that they offer hospitality. It seems like to be one of the things that's common across congregations across the world. And one of the things that started me off on my quest towards understanding my more spiritual side was a kind of concern with what's left of that in the secular world that I inhabited. You know, how do I account for that loss, and how do I make that loss sound meaningful? Because I don't think it is. I think it's something that my generation aren't doing very well, honestly, that we need to really think of new ways to welcome people in who otherwise have no welcome anywhere. And that's the spiritual question.
Yeah, and you I think at the beginning of this conversation you talked about connectedness, and really at the end of your book you rise to this soaring vision of connectedness. And when I was reading that, I was thinking, I wonder if Katherine has a Buddhist practice, or at least if the Buddhist philosophy speaks to you. It sounded like almost pure Buddhism.
Yeah, I think that's the one that I always get closest to, definitely. And sort of Taoism as well. I think that mysterious way is the thing that makes the most sense to me. The fact that it will always be a mystery and that you can't understand it, and that to pin it down is to make it escape even further. That always seems very pertinent to me, and very just very reflective of my experience, really.
Yes, because this is a book about waking up, which is, I think, really what Buddhism is about. Just wake up to everything that's around you. And I think, again, it goes back to your quixotic failed attempt to find the meteor shower. I love the fact that at one point you say you do have a meditation practice, but it wasn't really helping or engaging you in the same way when you were in this state of inertia. That didn't help. You needed a different kind of prescription.
Yeah, I mean, I learned to meditate, I think, like 17 years ago now. And I learned with a TM teacher. And for a few years, I found it absolutely perfect for me. But then it began to disintegrate because I was troubled by a lot of aspects of it. I was troubled by the demand for mystery within it, which it was kind of creating fake mysteries to me, because I had to keep my mantra secret, and I had, there were things, and there was this idea that there was this other level that wouldn't be revealed to me until I'd essentially paid a lot of money to take part in it. And I found that really troubling, and I realized that I couldn't fully commit to this as a belief system. But also it began to not fit with my life, and these strictures of 20 minutes twice a day, but also there were other things around, like you have to do it before you eat, and etc. etc. I began to think, I just can't do it. And for a long time, I tried my best, and I meditated in like shopping centres and in the corners of pubs, and I did all sorts of things. And only when I had my son, like, did it completely break down, because it was genuinely impossible. And I felt terrible about that. I felt really like I'd failed. And then I maybe began to think, actually, I was set up to fail. Like, this was never a system that was made for someone living my life. And the question instead is, how do we create practices that open up meditation? Because I'm a huge believer in meditation still, but to a range of different people with a range of different lives, and acknowledge the unevenness that most people will have to approach this with, and the imperfection that we bring to it, and acknowledge that as part of what we bring, actually, rather than as a deviation from the path, or a sort of, it takes you down the hierarchy, in a lot of these systems. And I wanted to really understand the different ways that people are meeting those states that aren't really acknowledged in our culture. And I write in the book about, how I'd love to see a room of male gurus, but specifically male gurus, sitting around listening to a woman who's, undertaken 10 years of caring responsibilities, and really hearing what it takes to go back. And God, I'm not talking about myself here, because I'm not that saintly, but I know plenty of people who go back into caring responsibilities day after day, night after night, losing sleep, putting their whole needs aside, without ever receiving any thanks, but doing it gently and with love, even when they're boiling over with frustration. Those people could definitely be teaching us all a huge lesson about how to walk a spiritual path, as much as someone that spends a lot of time meditating in a cave, which I would love to do, incidentally.
It's funny, I was reading, of all things, yesterday, Cormac McCarthy's pitiless new books, and even he says what the world needs is caring, not theory or theology. But you were just talking about...
That doesn't sound very Cormac McCarthy.
No, but he's 89 years old. Maybe he's come at that point in his life to what you already had. But I loved it, what you were just saying, essentially about offering something to people regardless of her background or orientation or whatever. And I just previously used the word prescription. And so for my last question, before I open it up to questions from the other friends in this conversation, how do you see this book in conjunction with Wintering? Because to me, it seems that they're both offering very down-to-earth prescriptions for those of us who feel lost, or as if we're not living fully the life we think we could live.
Yeah, I think my subject matter will always be small lives, and the sort of wonder and glory of small lives and restricted lives. And I always want to acknowledge that in my work. And I do think that Enchantment is the kind of what happens next after Wintering. It's the ... It almost kind of starts off where Wintering leaves off. And I do conceive of it as the sequel in a strange kind of a way, but not a narrative sequel. But it did come from the question, what do we need next? What do we need now? And so they're definitely companion pieces. And I love the way Riverhead has designed the cover so that the two sit together so beautifully visually, because that's true. Like, it's a truth. It's a really brilliant piece of design that shows that they are as of a set, and maybe there'll be a third at some point. And I keep wondering what color that will be. I can't help myself.
Yeah, anyone who ends up at Riverhead and working with the brilliant editor Jin Martin is already in heaven, I would say. The first question from one of our listeners comes from Neha Patel, and she says, follows on from what you were just saying. Sometimes life can be so lonely and terrifying that it's often hard to find wonder in anything. How do we open our hearts and minds to wonder and enchantment? Where do we start?
I think it's a slow practice, and I don't think we should ever expect for it to land at our feet. Actually, I think it's about the direction of our attention, and to do that, we're often starting from a really low base, and I think to do that, we actually have to start by trying to engage with our intuition, which can seem so far away, but if you can get your hands or your feet moving, it gives you a chance to get out of your head. And then what you have to do is try and find your curiosity. And that might seem so tiny, first of all, and so distant and such a pale signal. But if you keep following your own sense of fascination, or what interests you, what makes you curious, what makes you want to read a few pages on it, what makes you want to cross a field to have a look at it, that's the start. That's the start of it. And to do that within, these lonely, restricted lives that so many of us lead, you have to first of all acknowledge that it's there near to you, that it's absolutely possible for you to find it wherever you are, however degraded that place seems, and that it's not waiting for you somewhere imaginary across the world that's grander than this place. You keep coming back to it. You keep showing it faith, you keep showing it consistency, and it grows. And it really does grow, and you exercise it like a muscle.
Well, that flows beautifully into the next question from Patricia Lawrence, who asks, how do you see a relationship between enchantment and paradise?
I want you to answer this too. You answer this after I've tried.
I will. Okay.
You promise? Yeah. Okay. Paradise is your concern, and I don't think about paradise too much, actually. I think more about, because paradise seems to me to be something that's out of my control, something that's quite far away at this point in my life, maybe. But I think both of those concepts are about contact with a source, and are about feeling that direct hit of, electricity is, from my book, from 2 books ago, but the direct hit of electricity that you get when you come into contact with something that feels meaningful to you, or real, or revelatory of a bigger truth. And I think that's the relationship for me. And I think enchantment is a very paradisical experience, even if it's momentary. What would you say, though?
Well, and I think you also actually answered it perfectly in your answer to the previous question, but I would answer it with one of my favorite sentences from Enchantment, which is, take off your shoes because you're always on holy ground. And so, as you know from so kindly reading my book, that was my sense of paradise, just as you said previously, not looking across the world or into some state of perfection that none of us will ever find, but right here, right now, this is the best paradise we're going to find. Here we are, I'm sitting on a bright spring morning, getting to talk to you across the world. Let me cherish this moment. This is as good as it's going to get, rather than wishing I were on a beach in Tahiti, which probably wouldn't make me so happy.
So you can be very unhappy on a beach in Tahiti, can't you? Let's face it.
Very, very. Yeah. And I think just as you said, and we've been saying all along, enchantment and paradise are not things that you find by seeking out, but because they come upon you unexpectedly, like the moon shadow. But it's only when you look beyond you or come to your senses that you can see them. I think the Sufis have this great sentence, paradise is not available to seekers, but only seekers find it, or something like that. In other words, it's just like a shadow story, that had you not gone out for the meteor showers, you never would have found the moon shadow, which is such a thing of wonder for you and your son. Another question.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I'm just going to add a tiny thing to that I think both of us are circling, which is that it's a rather than an effort, it's actually a release, as it turns out. That it's a letting go of that, I don't know, that very forceful seeking and a kind of release into channeling instead.
Yes.
Maybe.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the liberations you're offering in the book, which is not to be embarrassed about the fact that sometimes we're stuck or we're not in our highest place or that we can't get ourselves going. I mean, one of the little subliminal strains in the book is how suddenly, as a writer and somebody who loves books, you couldn't read anymore. And I think, am I right in remembering you actually share that with a friend? And that's an important moment, not to be ashamed that you're not in that mood right now.
Completely. And in fact, the more people I told about it, the more people said back to me, no, I can't read either. So that's one of the reasons why sharing helps.
Yes. So I think, I mean, my sense is finding wonder partly has to do with going out, but partly accepting the fact that things are never going to be ideal and sometimes you're not going to find what you're looking for. Carol K. Condit has a very simple question. I can't see all of it, but it's for you. And she asks if you can share background information about the compelling door mural. And she asked something about Ladybug that I'm not accessing. Yes, can you tell us more about that?
It is not a door, it's a screen. And it is here to cover a multitude of sins in my office. I got tired of like looking, you know, you're on this screen and you can see what's behind you, and I got tired of thinking, oh, my room's so messy. So I've made myself a little booth in the corner of my office, and the screen is just ordered from an online store, and it's lovely. It's like birch trees, but the ladybird does annoy me a bit because it often looks like it's sitting on my head. Like, here we go.
It does like right now, yes.
Yeah. Really, it really gets on my nerves, the ladybird. I wish it was just the trees.
It's a nice example of wonder that can be found anywhere, because we looking at it think it's something marvelous and rare. Well, the ladybug, but the birch trees too, because as you said, it wasn't something special you got, but it looks special if you bring the right eyes to it.
Yeah, it's the life of the modern writer, isn't it? Like, we're all very concerned with our lighting now, and we all have to run basically a TV studio in the corner of our living room.
Yes, that's why I have such a dazzling background today, because in fact I'm sitting in this very bleak apartment, and so I've co-opted my mother's house in California to make it look as if I'm staying in somewhere golden.
As we come,
good, you thought I really was in this rapturous place. As we come towards the end of the hour, one thing we haven't talked about yet is play. I think Nietzsche said something like, we'd all be better off if we could play as seriously as we did when we were kids. And I wonder how play fits into your vision of enchantment and wonder.
Yeah, I mean, I think play is, for me, one of the ways that we can maintain this sense of enchantment. But I think to do that, we have to think carefully about what play means to us, because some of the vision of play that we've been handed down is actually a very thin version of play. And we're in the process of passing that thin version of play on to our children, because we dictate so much more of their time than our time was dictated. And we're teaching them to play in a very shallow way. Like, I talk about deep terrain and shallow terrain, and how children's play centres that I certainly spent a lot of time in when my son was smaller, these kind of rattling plasticky spaces that don't actually give kids the opportunity to modify their environment and to step outside of the adult expectation and into this, you know, these multiple childish uses that children always do. But I think that to really understand that, adults need to understand how they play. And play isn't always about fun. I mean, like, I actually think that the word fun is quite repulsive anyway, but that might just be me. And I inherited that from my grandmother, incidentally. but I think we need to understand how we play. And play, for me, I use Hertz's conception of deep play, is about this profound engagement with something that represents all of life and all of death. And is that important? You know, there's nothing insignificant about play. And I spent some time in the book exploring where my play is, and my play is definitely writing. and I really accept that play must look so dry to people who don't write or don't like writing, or who found writing really oppressive when they're at school. But that's where my mind roams. That's where I make mistakes. It's a difficult space that I take difficult thoughts to and engage in a difficult process of unraveling them. And that to me is profoundly playful.
I can't believe we're so much on the same wavelength. If you can believe it, this morning I woke up very early to conduct this conversation, and I wrote down in the context of writing, you have to give up fun in order to find joy. And exactly as you're saying, that fun is actually taking us in the wrong direction from what's really going to fulfill us at the deepest level. Well, we do have a question now from Geeta, and I think it's almost the perfect question maybe to end on, which is, could you speak about the role of hope? And secondly, how to hope when its absence is pressing in one's life? These are moving questions because I think they come from people, but these are not abstract inquiries.
No, absolutely. And I mean, hope is so enormous, isn't it? It's such an enormous emotion to channel. But I am a deeply hopeful person, and I don't, and the reason I'm hopeful, I think, is that I don't invest too much in the bigger processes going on in the world. I don't see them as actually much of my business increasingly. I have no control over them. I have no contact with them. I have no influence over them. And I don't truly understand them on an intuitive level. But the reason I'm hopeful is because I go out to notice things that make me hopeful. And whenever, you're exactly the same as this, I know from your book, I know you see this too, that whenever I'm in contact with other people, 99% of them are doing things that make me hopeful, and 1% are doing things that make me despair. Mm. And the vast witness of the world is to good. And I know that more crises are going to come, but that doesn't stop me from hoping, because I know also that humanity will rise to that challenge, and it will keep on taking care of other people, taking care of the weakest, because that is actually what we do when it boils down to an average. Whatever it is that we say we do, what we actually do is we take care of each other.
Mm. And when you were saying how you don't have control over huge events, I think the thrust of your book is you do have control and influence over so much how you spend your day, what you do with your son, where you train your attention. And that's where you're almost generating hope in your day-to-day life, I feel.
Yeah, that's where I can make, have an effect, have a meaningful effect. I have no meaningful effect over the behavior of Vladimir Putin, unfortunately. Mm. I would love to, but I don't. But he doesn't make me despair.
Mm. And I think how you have a meaningful effect on so many of the rest of us is by taking the time and trouble to get these sentences down onto the page. So I think we're just about coming up to the hour, and maybe I should hand it back to Avram. But what a privilege to talk to you, Katherine, and what a delight to read your book.
Thank you. It's gone so quickly. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
What an absolutely wonderful conversation. I think I speak for everyone. We could listen to you both all afternoon and evening long. Truly wonderful stuff. Katherine, Pico, thank you so much for joining us. And I think for everyone who is listening, I think you got a taste for just what is in this book. You should go out and get it, support Enchantment, support Katherine, get it at your local bookseller. Of course, we suggest Book Passage, Elliott Bay, or Rakestraw, but just, keep it independent. Thank you again, both of you, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. Good night.